Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the AI Spy. I hope you got our last episode with Dr. Detective Matthew Hogan. He talked about how money launderers are using video games as a vehicle for money laundering. Very interesting episode, so do catch that. Today, we're diving further into the topic of money laundering, and joining me today is Christian Leuprecht. He's the co-author of the book Dirty Money Inside Canada's Money Laundering Problem. So we're talking about money laundering. We're going to take a very specific look at why Canada is this perfect destination, but talk about money laundering in general. He describes himself as a divergent thinker. He talks about issues of national security, geopolitics. He's a professor at the Royal Military College. And I'm delighted and excited to have him. Christian, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure. Hello, nice to be here.
So, Christian, like I described, you talk about issues around national security, geopolitics. Actually, your LinkedIn banner, it says the open border paradox, US Canada. So you talk about these issues, but suddenly you write a book on financial crime. So why write and talk about financial crime, and why now?
Yeah, so these are all good questions, but I think the main aim here is to raise awareness on the one hand and raise the level of informed conversation. Like so many security challenges of the 21st century, financial crime might possibly be the most complex crime out there. It is a prolific crime. In Canada, money laundering alone, so leave aside sort of other forms of financial crime, is estimated in excess of $100 billion a year within Canada, flowing through Canada and flowing out of Canada. So this is a vast problem with significant second and third order effects, everything from the cost of living to public safety. Look at sort of your opioid crisis or your fentanyl crisis and the devastation that is having both in people's lives and in our communities. And yet it seems that the public is relatively disinterested. It feels that somehow this is a victimless crime or it doesn't affect them. And I think politicians, by and large, feel that this is not really something either they can do much about, they want to do much about, or that's not going to give them a whole lot of electoral payoff. So it's really sort of an effort to, I think, also to lower what economists might call the sunk costs or the cost of entry for others to engage in this problem. That is to say, scholars usually don't write about stuff where there's not a lot of information, and the information that there is very difficult to get, and the people who hold that information are difficult to access. And so part of this is also trying to spawn broader interest, hopefully for other professionals, practitioners, and scholars to get into this game, because it is, I think, one of the most vexatious and challenging and complex issues that we face in terms of national security, as well as regional and international stability, as well as public safety today. And so we have this great disconnect between magnitude, both in quantity and quality of the challenge, and the intent and effort to try to detect, contain, disrupt, and deter it.
Brilliant. So you said something that is I just love is you mentioned that we have to make this in a way. I'm paraphrasing what you said, but you said we have to make money laundering or financial crime unprofitable. It has to be so difficult, and I think this comes up in the book as well. The barrier to entry should be so high that the money launderers, the fraudsters, they should think twice. Like, oh, it's not profitable, so that will deter them from engaging in these activities. But something else that you said I want to focus on is the average person doesn't think about financial crime the same way that they think about border security. So is there a mindset shift that is required? And how would you say that it affects the average person? Are there any examples of how money laundering would affect the average person?
So two dimension to financial crime. One is sort of the rent-seeking behavior, right? So for instance, human trafficking, which is now globally more profitable than drug trafficking. So you can raise enormous amounts of money, and in many cases with relative impunity. Think of, for instance, the impact that the lack of beneficial ownership provisions is having on an industry such as sex trafficking, that is disproportionately profitable for the organized criminals that engage in it, and that is extremely destructive to people's lives in terms of vulnerability and exploitation, but where simple change in the way ownership structures have to be reported and made transparent and public can have an outsized impact in containing the rent-seeking, the profiteering motive behind a particularly heinous crime. So people often don't realize those types of connections. Similarly, with the fentanyl crisis, for instance, that 3 Mexican cartels have now set up shop in Canada. That Canada is now producing a significant surplus of fentanyl. Canada has become the top exporter of fentanyl to Australia and is on the verge of becoming the top exporter of fentanyl to Europe. So that we often perceive Canada either far away from the world's problems or that we're sort of a security and stability provider. We like to think, Canadians like themselves, good, smart Canadians like to think of themselves as, we have superior values in terms of sort of our political, economic, sort of social views, not realizing that Canada, with its very lax provisions around issues of financial economic crime, in particular global financial economic crime, is a significant purveyor of harm and instability, not just within our own country, but on the continent and internationally. The other is that much of the financial crime provisions are built around a precursor crime. So the idea is somebody commits a crime and then they're going to launder the proceeds. So that is to say, they take the dirty money and then they try to make it clean. The challenge is that in a globalized world, in many cases within Canada, given that sort of think of Canadian authorities or any other sovereign jurisdiction, authorities tend to have jurisdiction within that sovereign territory. There are few extraterritorial sort of provisions for law enforcement and intelligence, but largely the enforcement is within a territory. But a lot of the money that flows through Canada is not actually from crime within Canada. It is brought to Canada because it's relatively easy to bring money into Canada and because you can largely act, so the risks are very low of bringing money into Canada. The rewards are very high because it's a stable financial system. The chances of being caught are very low. And even if you get caught, chances are you're going to get off with relative impunity. So criminals call this criminologists call this criminogenic asymmetry. The bad guys aren't stupid. They're actually quite smart. They pick the jurisdictions where it's going to be the easiest for them to conduct certain types of activity. But the legislation that we have, by and large, has not caught up to the fact that it still sort of presumes that law enforcement is going to find a precursor crime and then we're going to prosecute for the precursor crime. Well, for one thing, there is no precursor crime in many cases, at least not in Canada. It's very difficult to prosecute for precursor crime in many cases to begin with. And so, can we also rethink some of the strategies that we employ here? Do we always need to throw people in jail? Or can we, if this is a rent-seeking activity and a laundering activity, if we just take people's assets, in particular through civil asset forfeiture, but also criminal asset forfeiture, we can significantly deter some of the motives that are causing people to engage both in the criminal activity and in the subsequent sort of laundering activity. And so this is part of when you say, you brought the borders analogy of trying to get people to think differently about the space. People still think about borders as sort of this line in the sand, and we kind of protect our country at the border. And so for one thing, the border is your last line of defense. When things show up at your border, things have already gone very wrong. Risks, threats, and so forth should never be showing up at your border at your last line of defense. And the other thing about borders is borders have been changing in the 21st century. They're very dynamic. We're pushing borders in, think about deportation, and we're pushing borders out. Now, what do you do in a world where financial flows are essentially global flows? There are no boundaries or borders. If you think about money, you think about data. And if you think about financial crime, the globalization on the one end has supercharged financial crime because it's not just the good folks that have benefited from it, it's also the bad folks. And the internet has supercharged it. If you think about cryptocurrency, 99% of NFT transactions are illicit transactions. And so that confluence of factors has significantly changed the global, transnational, and domestic financial crime space, but neither our legislation, nor the posture of our agencies, nor the mandates, nor the training, nor the way people think about these problems has adjusted. Where the puck is at, if you want to take a Canadian hockey analogy, let alone in terms of virtual assets, cryptocurrency, and decentralized finance. The puck is about to go in the next 5 years to supercharge that environment for financial crime even further.
So you mentioned about the transnational nature, and we talk about this in the book in several chapters that comes up. So the transnational national nature. You also mentioned that many times the precursor crime is outside. So given this transnational nature, you would tend to believe that the governments will start working together. There is FATF, which does AML regulations, talks to various geographies, talks to various jurisdictions, but is there work that the governments are doing together to combat money laundering? I've seen instances in specific cases they might, but is there coordinated effort? I will add a follow-up question. When I look at data privacy laws, that more and more geographies are adapting data privacy laws, I sometimes feel like as an anti-money laundering professional who designs systems, I feel like data privacy laws can be a deterrent because the country's data cannot go outside. So you cannot holistically analyze all the patterns that you can to expose a money laundering scheme. So again, I'll summarize my question. So is there international cooperation and data sharing across nations? And do you see that some of the data privacy laws are a deterrent when trying to break this transnational nature of money laundering?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, Canada faced considerable criticism from FATF. Some of those in the last country evaluation. It took the government years to address those. A government that likes to pride itself on sort of doing good for Canada and doing good for the world ultimately only took action, for instance, some of the criticisms with regards to virtual assets in 2022 when it came under significant political duress from the Ottawa Convoy. So that, on the one hand, shows that if politicians want to do something about it, they can, that this is ultimately a matter of political will. And look, we live in a democracy. Politicians and the people we elect ultimately make the rules, right? And so, part of the objective of the book is saying that people should expect more from their politicians in terms of pressure that they should be putting on them. Yes, is often held up as the global standard. The problem is, for advanced democratic and financial jurisdictions such as Canada, FATF is the absolute minimum benchmark that any country has to meet. So when Canada faces significant criticism, and Canada is likely about to face even more severe criticism in the latest country evaluation, it shows that our approach is simply inadequate. It is inadequate for a G7 country. It is inadequate for a NATO founding member that prides itself on regional as a provider of regional and global stability. And it is simply inadequate for a self-respecting member of the United Nations that pretends to be all about global norms and norms transfer and setting the standard, that loves to talk about human rights and so forth. Well, one way we can start is actually trying to, be a good global citizen when it comes to financial crime. It is very clear that Canada is being a very bad global citizen in the community of democratic and advanced sort of financial nations. The provisions, I think, in place, so ultimately, and I think we haven't had a lot of expectations when it comes to financial crime. The data cooperation piece is generally difficult. I think we're getting better at it transnationally. You now see, especially among the Five Eyes community of countries, so the United States, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, and New Zealand, you see more cooperation on things such as borders, on law enforcement, so criminal intelligence, security intelligence, migration, signals intelligence. So we're starting to see some emergent cooperation. We also see some of this in the European Union, where we now finally have a financial intelligence unit at the EU level, not just at sort of the domestic levels, to try to contain some of the challenges, especially in some of the jurisdictions in Eastern and Central Europe, among the newer EU member countries. But in Canada, we have a very particular problem that FinTrack, so our financial intelligence, Canada's financial intelligence unit, was set up as an administrative unit, not as an enforcement mechanism. There was a variety of reasons for this. Part of the essence was, let's learn to walk before we run. But it looks very different from other democratic jurisdictions, even other jurisdictions that have come under significant criticism and duress, such as Australia. But if you look at Australia, where AUSTRAC has levied fines of on two of the two major casino operators, 450 million Australian dollars. on Combank and Westpac. Combank, a $700 million fine. Westpac, I believe, a $1.4 billion fine. We're talking real money here, right? What has FinTrack done? They've leveled a couple of fines in the millions of dollars. In the case of RBC, the fine that they levied last year was 49% of the bonus that the CEO of RBC received that year. It is hardly a deterrent, how we're going about this in Canada, to entice financial institutions, for instance, to do better. I believe in many cases, for not just in Canada, but around the world, for most financial institutions, it's just a cost of doing business. You're going to get caught every now and then.
Yeah.
You're going to pay the fine. Ironically, that fine will be tax deductible anyways because it's a cost of business. And so you just move on. Because it's ultimately better for business to retain those problematic clients, in part because the amounts of money involved are so large that it's simply not really worthwhile. And we can see this in the way Toronto Dominion, for instance, went about this, that in its particular case, much of sort of the financial sort of fraud, crime sort of issues fell under the auspices of people who looked after privacy and people's data. And so what's known as PI, personal identifying information, the approach basically was, we're not going to share anything with anyone ever, unless you show up with a warrant and you tell us you want this or that. And look, that got TD in a lot of trouble, but ironically, not in Canada, but in the United States, where FinCEN and the Treasury took aggressive action on the shortcomings. It's led to a significant restructure within TD, but it shows that if the C-suite makes it a priority, there's actually significant action that we can take. But if we want to deter bad behavior, and we got to remember, about only 10% of those problematic financial flows flow through large banks. 90% shows up in forms of trade-based money laundering and all sorts of other ways that don't actually, in many cases, touch the banks directly. So don't just want to impugn the banks. But I think the most effective way that we can deter this type of behavior isn't actually through fines, although large fines are part of, I think, the conversation. It is actually effectively imposing professional penalties on those individuals within financial institutions who either enable or tolerate this type of behavior. That is to say, if you're an accountant, if you're a lawyer, if you're another type of professional, we are going to take your professional license. You can no longer practice as a lawyer. You can no longer practice as an accountant. That is to say, we will deprive you of your livelihood. I'm only familiar with one case where that was done, in the case of a Swiss bank at the insistence of a compromise with the US Treasury and FinCEN. But I think seven senior executives were sanctioned in that particular way. But I think that is probably, in terms of the banks and the C-suites, the most promising way forward. And I think, rather than referring individuals to professional organizations, such as the Law Society of Upper Canada or so, to decide whether they should be sanctioned or so, the C-suite themselves can say, if you tolerate or engage in this type of behavior in our institution, you're out.
So I have two more questions that I want, but I'm now going to switch and talk about the book. In the book, there are several contributors. You and Dr. Farrell obviously start with the introduction. You contribute a few chapters, but there are other contributors like Dr. Laksana Ahmed has a chapter. There's John Carasso. There are many contributors. So when writing a book, how difficult was it to coordinate all of that and then structure the book? What was the process like, and how difficult was it?
So there hadn't been a book in financial crime in 16 years on Canada. Or the late Margaret Beer and Stephen Schneider, who has a chapter in the book on mafia type activity. So that was sort of part of the effort that, it tells you something nobody's published on in 16 years. It's very hard to write on this topic, and it's very complex. So I tried to gather all the people in the country, many of them not academics, many of them professionals or practitioners from private sector experience, public sector, so across the different domains to write on this. Now, we missed a couple of people I approached who weren't able to write. There are some blind spots, for instance. We don't have a chapter on terrorist financing in this country. Canada has long been known, for instance, to have communities that are very sympathetic to extremist organizations, in particular in the Middle East, but also elsewhere. Think of, for instance, the support for Tamil Tigers in Canada was within the community. Often coerced support was well known. So there are some areas that we don't cover in the book. I mean, the book's over 400 pages. There's only so much you can do. We also, I think, tried very hard to ensure we had new voices. We had a diverse set of voices. We had younger voices. We had women in the conversation. We had an interdisciplinary approach from criminologists to lawyers to economics to political science, policy studies. So trying to get a variety of angles. So setting the scene, what are the challenges? Why is it so difficult to do stuff? What are some of the emerging dimensions? So for instance, underground banking, cryptocurrency, and then ultimately, what's the opportunity space? What can, should be, needs to be done? The Canadian federal government recently changed some of the beneficial ownership provisions in terms of making those more transparent, for instance. But we make a big deal of this, but the threshold to register is fairly high still for federally incorporated entities, and a majority of the provinces still have no provisions on beneficial ownership. So that means, you're just going to incorporate provincially in some jurisdiction where you don't have to disclose. So it's, these are challenges of a federation. But so trying to kind of get the full, cover the waterfront in terms of the conversation. There are really interesting, I think many of the chapters are, I think all of the chapters have novelty and something really interesting to offer. I'm not sure there's another book out there on financial crime that gives you that many different dimensions. So in that sense, it's not just about Canada, it's also sort of about trying to understand, take a more holistic and integrated approach to the problem.
So I agree. There are a lot of interesting chapters, and what I love about the book is that you can read those chapters standalone. You don't have to necessarily read the book cover to cover. You can look through the index, you find a chapter that's interesting, you can pick that chapter, start reading that chapter. Obviously, you want to recommend. I recommend, and you in the introduction you explain the structure of the book, how it's a 4-part, similar to what you just spoke, how the structure of the book is. But you can, if you are pressed for time, if you want to pick and choose chapters, that is possible. And one of my favorite chapters in the book is authored by Sanaa Ahmed, Running with the Hare, Hunting with the Hounds. I feel like this chapter really exposes the contradictions that the governments have when formulating regulations around money laundering. So they have to do the balance between economic benefit and stopping illicit activity or financial crime. And she writes about this very well. If now I want to ask you, do you have a favorite chapter? Or if you had to recommend one chapter, if someone had time only to read a single chapter, which one would you recommend?
Look, Dr. Ahmed's chapter is fantastic. She's a terrific person. Her personal biography is just so incredibly interesting. I think the reason why she can also write so engagingly is she was a journalist earlier sort of in her life in a place that's very dangerous, Pakistan, for journalists. And so she also brings, I think, that ability to understand the intersection of journalism, of financial crime. And of course, she draws sort of this really interesting dichotomy between Canada. You want to bring money into Canada? We ask no questions. But you want to come to Canada, let alone you want to settle in Canada? We're going to ask you all sorts of questions. So this interesting approach, it sort of shows this dichotomy that, politicians basically think, financial crime in many cases is free money. Right? It's money they didn't have to work for. It's money that we didn't have to add productivity or something like that to the economy. And so I think, it exposes both those duplicities, I think, on both the immigration side and financial crime side in the way that Canada in general, but in particular the current government has approached both those files. I also particularly am partial to Cam Field and Pam Simpson's chapter because it's going to be, for government to do something about this, I mean, government is a bit like the Titanic, right? It's a big ship. When it comes to financial crime in Canada, it's listing badly. And, I think there's some promising signs that we could do things differently, but it's going to take a long time. It's always going to be limited. So our best partner is going to be the private sector. And it's going to be to convince the private sector that it is not in the private sector's interest to in any way to enable or inadvertently facilitate that type of activity, and to also point out the reputational risk of doing so, right. As in particular TD Bank, for instance, in Canada has recently learned, where, and in terms of its own sort of profitability and stock price, for instance. So, I think this is so the private sector, and we have a number of private sector initiatives that have been very successful. In most of these have not been top-down but bottom-up sort of initiatives. On sex trafficking, for instance, and the collaboration between the Bank of Montreal and FinTrack in trying to curtail some of that activity in collaboration with local law enforcement. It is still way too prolific in Canada. But there's a number of good news stories there, and I think we need to think much harder about, there's always some things that government will have to do because it has access to the ability to integrate data to the intelligence and so forth. But by and large, like any of these elements in a liberal democracy, we probably don't want to give too much power to the state. Instead, we want to enable non-state actors and incentivize them to do the right thing. And I think in Canada currently, we're doing fantastically well at doing neither.
All right. We're coming up on time. Christian, thank you for taking time out today and sharing your time with us, sharing your opinions. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. We are coming towards the 1-year anniversary of the book. I think it was launched last September, so around the 1-year mark. It's a fabulous read. I would recommend everyone who's a practitioner who works in financial crime prevention to read it. But also, if you're a scholar, if you are curious about the topic, do pick up the book. I will share a link to where they can purchase the book. I'm not affiliated with you or Amazon in any way, but I just feel that people should read the book. It's a great read. Again, thank you for taking your time out, and thank you for joining.
And I make no money off the book. The price simply covers the costs of producing the book. So there you go. There's no rent-seeking behavior on my part. Thanks for the lovely conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a great day.
Take care.
And best of luck.